Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. This week it's Valentine's Day, so it only feels fitting that we cover off a thematically relevant remake that leapt off the screen in 2009. It's the story of a blue-collar mining town where, after suffering a series of violent tragedies over consecutive Valentine's holidays, local law enforcement officers find themselves in pursuit of a potential serial killer. And while police close in, the killer's victims and the identity of the murderer himself may share a deeper connection to the town's own haunted past, including that of a prior masked maniac who's been assumed dead for the past 10 years. Is this a copycat killer, or has the original Valentine's Day Massacre killer somehow returned to kill again? I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is My Bloody Valentine 3D. It's 1998 in the small-town mining community of Harmony, and before the series of now infamous murders would occur over the Valentine's Day holiday, the town would experience another well-publicized tragedy. Now, this disaster occurred around 6:50 p.m. Eastern Time on the evening of February 14th, 1998, in the now infamous Hanniger Mines, which is a local mine operation just outside of town that employed many of the inhabitants of Harmony itself. In interviews conducted with staff on site at the time, lead mining foreman Mark Riggs reported that when clocking out for the evening around 6:25 p.m., there was only one crew remaining in tunnel number 5 where the tragedy would occur, a mere 25 minutes later. Authorities are alerted to reports of what seems to be some kind of a massive explosion, in addition to earth tremors felt throughout the nearby surrounding area. And after investigators liaise with the National Earthquake Information Center, confirming that there is no reported seismic activity or natural occurrence anywhere in the area, they instead expand the search for any potential industrial-type accidents that may have occurred. It isn't long before police and rescue teams locate the source of this alleged explosion. The Hanniger mine itself, specifically that of tunnel number 5, has suffered a near-complete collapse. And even more tragic, it appears that a group of miners are still trapped inside. Now, police identify these trapped miners as a 6-man crew that was led by foreman Harry Warden, and county rescue teams waste no time in launching recovery efforts to save the lives of these trapped individuals. It would be days before rescuers were able to successfully clear enough of the debris and structural damage in order to reach this trapped mining team. But what they would discover would shake the community and law enforcement officials right down to the core. Tragically, all but one of the trapped miners are found deceased. Only as investigators probe further, their deaths might not be the result of the collapse whatsoever, but instead are determined to have been a homicide. Now, to pause for a second, in the year following the collapse at the Hanniger mine, there were many court cases to follow. Though through a series of what many consider to be arguable loopholes, official and formal charges were never actually laid in the case itself. It was determined that the owners of the mine, named as Eli Hanniger and future murder victim Ben Foley, did actually maintain safety standards within the mine itself, including both the regular maintenance and upkeep of the facility, as well as adequate training procedures for the many on-site staff that were employed there. However, as was heavily reported by local news outlet The Daily Harmony, police actually did interview a person of interest at the time of the mine's collapse, who was identified by local authorities as none other than Tom J. Hanniger, a local star quarterback of the Harmony High Panthers, as well as the son of the prominent owner of the mine itself. Now, it's determined by officers that Tom Hanniger had a lapse in preventative measures during his shift on February 14th, wherein he failed to properly maintain safety standards in his operation of gas lines within the mine itself, namely his responsibility in releasing the pressure from these lines to avoid excess buildup of methane. The result of this pressure buildup is determined to have caused the explosion within tunnel number 5 itself. And in police interviews, as well as documents submitted to the courts, it's noted that legal teams actually did try to pursue potential charges against Tom Hanniger for criminal negligence causing death. However, the charges here actually don't stick for one simple reason. The deaths of these miners in tunnel number 5 were technically not a direct result of the explosion, nor were they a result of the tunnel collapsing at all. The deaths of the 5 workers at Hanager Mine were instead attributed to one person, the surviving foreman and now infamous serial killer, Harry Warden. Investigators led by Sheriff Jim Burke initially came to this conclusion after discovering blunt force trauma damage to all of the workers that were present that was not consistent with any sort of impact damage or explosion trauma from the collapse itself. These workers were discovered to have been killed by a severe puncture wound to the skull, and blood samples taken from the scene are matched to that of a pickaxe tool that was also located near the bodies. It's determined through autopsy that this pickaxe weapon was used in the murder of these 5 workers, which was theorized to police to be a morbid attempt by Harry Warden to conserve his own oxygen supply in order to survive the ordeal in time for a potential rescue. Now, this horrific plan initially works. Harry Warden was rescued and admitted to the local Harmony Memorial Hospital. However, before police can formally arrest or interrogate the suspect, his own health would suffer a rapid decline. Due to what attending medical staff determined to be a cerebral dysfunction that was likely caused from extended periods of low oxygen levels, Harry Warden actually falls into a coma and instead remains under medical hospice care at Harmony Memorial in the hopes that he can one day potentially stand trial for his crimes if he was to recover. And it's approximately 1 year later, on Valentine's Day 1999, that Harry Warden would suddenly wake from his coma, only now he would resume his violent acts from the Hanager Mine and launch into a new killing spree where he would claim a staggering 15 additional victims in a series of murders coined by media outlets as the Valentine's Day Massacre. Police first respond to the crime scene at Harmony Memorial on the evening of February 14th, 1999, where crime scene photographs showcase a truly grisly scene. 9 of Harry Warden's victims are located within the hospital itself, determined to have been murdered at the hands of the killer in his attempts to escape the grounds. The victims included a combination of staff as well as patients, and their various causes of death tend to range, with most being the result of fatal penetrative wounds from various hospital surgical tools. Police notes also indicate a particularly gruesome detail that would become a mainstay in both of the Valentine's Day Massacre cases. For reasons unknown, Harry Warden removed the hearts of some of his victims, often crudely staging these organs within the crime scenes themselves. He also left various messages to police written in his victims' blood, which would become another staple in the later crimes in 2009. Now, it's ultimately unclear as to why Harry Warden returned to his initial crime scene, the now condemned Tunnel Number 5 at Hanager Mine, where he would ultimately continue his killing spree. Investigators and behavioral analysts believe that Warden may have actually suffered from ongoing brain damage, and that the routine familiarity of his place of work or last known location before he succumbed to his coma might have been an almost natural draw for the killer. Either way, police discover that after his escape from Harmony Hospital, Harry Warden did flee back to the Hanager Mine, and by the time authorities locate and subdue him, this Valentine's Day killer would tragically claim 6 more lives. The first officers to respond to Tunnel Number 5 were Sheriff Burke and Officer Hinch. Reports from both police officers indicate that the victims discovered within the mine itself were made up of mostly high school students, who had seemingly snuck away to the condemned mine shaft for some kind of a party of sorts. In crossing paths with Harry Warden, all of these victims were murdered in similar fashion, using a pickaxe that police theorize the killer likely obtained from the crime scene itself. Harry Warden was located by police seemingly while these killings were actually taking place, and their intervening actions miraculously saved the lives of 4 students who may have otherwise been killed at the hands of Warden himself. Officers report that Warden was shot a total of 4 times before he retreated further into the collapsed mine. And while police did further pursue him, his body was actually not recovered or located in their efforts. It's assumed that Harry Warden succumbed to his injuries and likely died somewhere in the confines of the mine shaft itself. And due to the unsafe and structural integrity of the mine being compromised, recovery efforts of Warden's body were ultimately abandoned. Now, news outlets were understandably buzzing surrounding the 1999 Valentine's Day Massacre, and while the bloody tragedy would claim many lives, authorities and residents in the town of Harmony are at this point just ready to put the horrors of Harry Warden behind them forever. And with the killer's alleged death at the hands of police, the case is considered closed, and it would remain that way for years to come, Well, that is, until 2009, when a full 10 years later, the town of Harmony would endure another Valentine's Day massacre, resulting in a new series of deaths and potentially an all-new masked killer. Now, at the time of the 2009 case, many of the original investigators and also surviving victims had long since moved on from the original massacre. The leading investigator in the new murders was actually a survivor of the previous attack in 1999, that of now Sheriff Axel Palmer. Together with his lead deputy officer Martin, these officers first respond to a reported murder at the local Thunderbird Motel on the date of February 12th, where they discover 3 bodies in various crime scenes within the property. The first of these victims is a male found in the parking lot of the hotel, specifically near a transport truck that was determined through license and registration to have also been owned by the victim in question. He was killed with a single penetrative wound to the base of his skull, the force of which autopsy confirms fatally damaged his brain. And when canvassing the hotel grounds, police discover a second body, that of a hotel manager named Celine. She's located in her residence on scene, that doubled as a manager's office, where she's also found to have been impaled through the skull, and further inspection and measurement of her entry wound determines that the weapon that was used in her murder was likely the same one used in the male victim found outside, indicating that both victims were killed by the same person. The final victim discovered at the Thunderbird Motel is located in room number 5 and is identified as female victim Irene Donnelly. Her body was staged in the bathtub of the motel room, where crime scene photographs showcase an extremely violent and bloody scene. Her ultimate cause of death is determined to be from extreme blood loss from an extensive trauma wound to her chest cavity, a combination of both blunt force and penetrative lacerations. While Irene's body was located in room number 5, it's theorized that she was actually murdered within the same vicinity as other victim Celine, as blood samples matching that of Irene were also located at the crime scene within the manager's office of the hotel. Police now suggest that Irene was likely transported and staged in room number 5 after her death, and upon further examining of her corpse, they make a series of startling discoveries connecting these murders to the original Valentine's Day massacre an entire 10 years prior. Autopsy here determines that Irene Donnelly was missing her heart, the same MO that the killer Harry Warden would use on select victims of his killing spree in 1999. In addition, police reports confirm that Irene herself was one of the surviving victims of the Tunnel No. 5 massacre at the hands of Harry Warden himself. And investigators suggest that this actually might be why her body was specifically chosen to be staged as it was, and seemingly why she was so brutally targeted compared to the other victims on scene. And when police check the visitor logs of the hotel during their investigation, they make another connection to the 1999 case, offering a possible suspect in these new murders and potentially even a future victim. Staying in room number 4, right next to where the victim was discovered, is none other than Tom Hanniger, the same individual at the center of the mine collapse controversy in 1998, and yet another survivor of the Tunnel No. 5 massacre by Harry Warden in 1999. Now, it doesn't take long at this point for the theories to start to fly. The initial thought here is that these killings could possibly be at the hands of a returning Harry Warden, who somehow survived the shooting at Hanniger Mine 10 years ago, and is possibly targeting the survivors of his original massacre. Now, this theory was supported at the time by both methods used in the 2009 killings, as well as recovered video evidence of the killer, who was found to have been adorned from head to toe in a miner outfit, complete with a miner's mask that concealed his face. Now, this was the same outfit that Harry Warden was found to have been wearing during his altercation with police 10 years ago. In another theory, investigators suggest that this might also be some kind of a copycat killer, operating with the same MO as Harry Warden, in an attempt to confuse police and potentially throw them off. This theory was also supported by retired Sheriff Jim Baker, given the fact that he was quite confident at the time that Harry Warden was killed in 1999 and couldn't have possibly survived the encounter with police and numerous gunshot wounds to his body. In addition, while on the surface it might have seemed possibly implicating, the presence of Tom Hanniger at the crime scene, as indicated by his signature on the visitor's log, might have also painted him as a potential victim or a target of the killer, and police suggest that if Tom was a suspect in the case, he would have likely instead used a different name when checking in so as to not implicate himself. Now, the truth, however, would prove to be far more twisted, and as the case progresses, the identity of this masked killer as well as his potential motives would be confirmed by responding authorities. Now, despite the various initial theories in the new Valentine's Day massacre, this new masked murderer was infamously confirmed to be Tom Hanniger. Now, this came as a cultural shock to the community in Harmony, as while Tom had faced some scrutiny in the past due to his involvement in the Hanniger mine disaster, he was also considered to be a prominent figure within town, and had recently returned after a 10-year hiatus to potentially sell or take over the Hanniger family mines after the death of his father. However, while police authorities faced some serious backlash, namely why it took so long to identify Tom as the killer despite the seemingly overwhelming evidence at the time, the investigation notes do actually offer some insights as to why this case wasn't so cut and dry as it might have appeared to the outside general public. See, medical records obtained by authorities indicate that Tom Hanniger had spent the better part of almost 7 years at a psychiatric institution. Now, this was following the events of the 1999 Tunnel No. 5 massacre, at which Tom was actually one of the surviving victims. While the specific details of Tom's treatments at this facility are unclear, it's suggested by medical experts that he likely developed a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder, supported by prescribed medication that was located in his vehicle, impounded by police as evidence at the conclusion of the case. Now, experts here theorize that his extensive trauma might have actually manifested in numerous ways, including hallucinations and paranoia, and even as far as alternate personas, all of which presented in this killer, according to lead investigator Axel Palmer. Analysts believe that it's possible that Tom Hanniger committed these murders due to his own mental state, and given his unresolved guilt in the 1999 murders as well as the 98 tragedy, he then assumed the identity and mantle of this infamous Valentine's Day killer Harry Warden to enact a new series of murders himself as the result of his mental break. Now, long before police would make this official connection, Tom Hanniger would claim a total of 5 additional victims, the first of which actually occurred back at the Hanniger coal mines. Witness statements indicate that Tom Hanniger arrived at the facility to allegedly speak to the site supervisor, and he was taken down deep into the mines themselves by one of the foremen, a male victim identified as simply Red. Now, this same male individual was shortly thereafter discovered brutally murdered on site, having suffered a blunt force trauma wound to the skull from what seemed to be that of a pickaxe, the same weapon used in the previous murders. In addition, later autopsy to his body revealed that he also suffered a total of 9 impact wounds to the torso, a particularly violent attack from the same weapon. So you might be asking yourself, why then did police not immediately arrest and charge Tom Hanniger when they arrived at the scene? I mean, at this point, he's been at 2 of the crime scenes so far, and in the eyes of the police, he has to be suspect number 1. Well, the answer here lies within the witness statements provided by fellow miners, who actually got to the crime scene before these responding authorities. These witnesses report that upon discovering Red's body, they also located Tom Hanniger, only he was seemingly locked in a supply closet nearby. Now, yes, it was revealed later that Tom had likely somehow locked himself in the supply area, but at the time, it seemed like a pretty cut and dry alibi, and his own claims that he witnessed the killer committing the murder, even going so far as to describe him as Harry Warden, further assisted in his potential innocence at this point of the case. And due to this lack of hard evidence, Tom Hanniger was allowed to walk free, and as would soon be discovered, it would have fatal consequences. The next victim would share another connection to Hanniger's own haunted past, specifically that of the mining tragedy in 1998, in that the victim was none other than Ben Foley, the co-owner of Hannigan Mine. Foley was discovered missing from his home, and after police locate blood samples at the scene as well as evidence of a struggle, they managed to track Foley's body to the surrounding woods of Tunnel No. 5, where he's found in a shallow grave. Ben Foley was killed when a sharp object passed through his eye cavity and pierced his brain, the 5th confirmed victim of Tom Hanniger. Now, the next murder would take place during an altercation at the local Mercer grocery store, where in an attack that might have initially seemed random by authorities, the victim discovered by police was identified as store employee Megan. Her body was found at the exterior of the building, and in the same MO as the other victims in the case, her heart was seemingly removed from within her chest cavity. However, this attack was not random at all. It was determined by police that the killer might have actually been targeting another potential victim, that of female victim Sarah Palmer, who was another survivor of the Valentine's Day massacre in 1999, and happened to work as a store manager at Mercer grocery store in 2009. And hand, as witness statements indicate, Sarah Palmer also had a previous romantic relationship with none other than Tom Hanniger. Now, it's worth noting here that while the credibility of the Harmony Police Department was heavily questioned surrounding the case, notes and statements here indicate that Sheriff Axel Palmer strongly believed that Tom Hanniger was the murderer in the majority of the investigation. It's easy to assume that there's probably too much evidence linking Tom to the case to be considered circumstantial. He had a history with the victims, he was present at numerous crime scenes so far, but in the eyes of the law and the justice system, there's just simply not enough strong evidence to make a formal arrest here. And coupled with the contradictory witness statements from other survivors, it no doubt made the case way more complex to navigate for investigators. Now, at this point in the case, investigators are sure of one thing, that whoever this killer is seems to be targeting those with direct connections or involvement to the events 10 years prior. And as such, police presence is significantly increased in the area, namely at the residence of Sarah Palmer, in the case that the killer might return to finish what he started at the grocery store. And that's exactly what would happen. At the time of the next two murders that took place at the Palmer residence, Police Deputy Ferris was stationed on guard outside the house, alongside retired Sheriff Jim Burke. Ferris's police logs indicate that at some point during the night they were made aware of a disturbance within the house, from loud noises and what sounded like a commotion coming from within. Upon entering the premises, Officer Ferris discovers the body of a housekeeper, identified only as Rosa, who was disturbingly found inside a dryer appliance in the laundry room of the home. Now, autopsy later revealed that Rosa had been killed by a single blow to the head from a sharp object. And despite extensive burn wounds to her person, investigators believe that she was actually concealed within the appliance itself after the murder took place, evidenced by extensive blood spatter patterns on the exterior of the dryer itself. Now, due to the fact that victim Jim Burke was alive during the initial entry into the house, it's suggested by forensics that Burke was actually killed outside, while Officer Ferris secured the interior of the home. Burke's body was located in a hedge near the porch of the house, where he suffered a single piercing wound to his chin that exited through the roof of his mouth, causing the entire removal of his lower jaw in the process. Now, at this point, Sheriff Palmer receives word that his wife, the aforementioned surviving victim Sarah Palmer, has seemingly gone missing. And after successfully reaching her on the phone, albeit according to records very briefly, Sarah is able to identify that she's headed to Hanniger Mine, and that she's accompanied by none other than Tom Hanniger. The final police altercation with the masked serial killer in the 2009 Valentine's Day Massacre would end in the same place it began 10 years prior, in the condemned site of Tunnel Number 5 in the Hanniger Mine. It's here that Tom Hanniger officially revealed himself as the killer and proceeded to attack both Sarah Palmer and her responding husband and police officer, Axel Palmer. Though this interaction and altercation would yield some more interesting information about Tom's motivations as a serial killer. It's reported by both Sarah and Axel's witness statements that Tom Hanniger suffered a mental episode during their interaction at the time, even going so far as to seemingly almost hallucinate the presence of Harry Warden. It was during this episode that Hanniger seemed to almost switch personalities entirely, shifting from Tom's persona to the murderous killer he had been seemingly hiding underneath all along. And it's also during this altercation with Sheriff Palmer and surviving victim Sarah Palmer that Tom Hanniger suffered a seemingly fatal gunshot wound to the torso, which also managed to, probably ironically, rupture a fuel line within the mine shaft itself, igniting the gas within and causing a massive explosion. The impact resulted in yet another partial collapse of the mine, nearly sealing the survivors within Tunnel Number 5 and also repeating its tragic past. Miraculously, however, both surviving victims managed to escape with only minor injuries, where they were able to provide authorities and media with their own accounts of the events of the Valentine's Day Massacre, including the apparent demise of killer Tom Hanniger. And yes, I did say apparent there. It's important to note here that while a body was recovered from the debris and cave-in within the tunnel itself, this body was not the body of Tom Hanniger. but was confirmed to be that of a responding emergency worker. Now, this ID wasn't actually formally confirmed until the autopsy was performed, as damage to the victim's skull and face was, at the time, consistent with injuries suffered from the mine collapse. It was assumed then that this was Tom Haniger's body. However, responding officer notes indicate that this victim in question was only partially clothed at the time of his discovery, and that his typical attire, that of a miner's mask in responding rescue team uniform, was ultimately unaccounted for. So while it's entirely possible that Tom Haniger did in fact die in tunnel number 5, that his body might simply have been buried somewhere down there and inaccessible, some instead believe that he might have somehow made it out, possibly concealing himself disguised as one of the workers, and that this Valentine's Day killer may have in fact survived this heart-wrenching series of murders. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on My Bloody Valentine 3D. I've said a few times that I'm a huge fan of the late 90s and early 2000s horrors, and this one's really no exception for me. There's just a whole vibe to this era of horror movies. The whodunit style of this one is a little bit wild considering the staggering amount of evidence against Tom the police would have. They would probably lock this dude up in a heartbeat, no pun intended. But even still, it's a pretty fun ride. This 2009 remake was actually shot entirely in 3D at the time, so it's got that trope that you see in 3D movies where stuff is just constantly shoved into the camera, but it ends up coming off kind of hilariously awkward nowadays when it's not viewed in its original 3D format. I've admittedly never seen the 1981 original film, which is probably pretty terrible of me considering it's a Canadian slasher, but from what I understand, the remake is pretty much largely the same story beats with just some of the characters and motives switched around here and there. Plus, the 2009 version was the one I'm most familiar with, and I remember it pretty fondly from back in the day. There was discussion of a sequel being made to this, but apparently it didn't do so well at the box office, so I guess it's kind of a one and done at this point. Though with the resurgence of requels and legacy sequels, hey, you never know, maybe the miner makes a comeback. And that's all for this week's Valentine's themed episode. If you want to celebrate the holiday by checking out My Bloody Valentine 3D, whether solo or otherwise, it's currently available to rent on Prime at the time of this podcast release. As always, I'm your host Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.